Now recently I did a video on Hedgerow Tactics, and some people ask why the US did not just use flamethrowers to burn down all the hedgerows in Normandy, in the Bocage area. I didn't find a direct note in the books and articles I read, but there are a lot of reasons why I think this was not done and also wouldn't have really worked. Although at first, of course, it sounds like a feasible idea, just burn everything down, but yeah, there are some issues here. So let's start with what we actually know. The hedgerows were overcome with various means. The Sherman Rhino was actually at the end of several incremental and parallel developments by various formations and units. So there was a lot going on there in Normandy back then. It was not just, okay, we came up with the Rhino and then we solved the problem. There were several approaches. One of the first attempts to breach the hedgerows was actually with explosives. The 747th Tank Battalion was not equipped with dozer tanks, so instead of trying to drive directly over the hedgerows, someone suggested that demolitions be used to blow gaps in the hedgerows. After experimentation, the tankers discovered that demolitions could indeed breach the hedgerows. Two 24-pound explosive charges placed 8 feet apart and 18 inches above ground level blew a sizable hole in a hedgerow. Although explosives were a suitable method in breaching the hedgerows, it was not particularly efficient from the material side, because there were a lot of hedgerows. This meant one would need a lot of explosives, and luckily we have some data here. The commander of the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion assumed that in a typical attack, a tank company moving a distance of 1.5 miles through the Bocage would encounter 34 separate hedgerows. As a result, each tank company needed 17 tons of explosives. Demolitions were not readily available in such quantities, and the problems involved in the transport and emplacement of enough explosives seemed insurmountable. Now, what does this have to do with flamethrowers? Well, if you're making a hole with explosives and you require a certain amount of ammo, you can guess how much fuel you would need to burn down all those hedgerows. Remember, this is Normandy, not a dried up spot somewhere in the United States or Australia. So you would need quite a lot of fuel. Because if everything would have been dry, as like in California during summer or something, basically Normandy would have burned down before D-Day, considering how much bombs the Allies dropped, and during D-Day even more, and after D-Day. So basically, if it would have been that easy, Normandy or a large part of France would have been a wasteland already before the Allies would have set foot on the Normandy beaches. And there's a very special difference because we know the weather was basically back then extremely wet. July 1944 was one of the wettest and windiest in 50 years. Now let's assume you have enough flamethrower fuel, but you need also a lot of flamethrowers for this job, or ideally flamethrower tanks. And from what I read, the US forces had a very limited amount of flamethrower tanks in summer 1944. Of course the British had some, but we are talking about the US attempts here. But for the sake of argument, let's assume the US forces get flamethrower tanks from the British or some other means. But then there's another issue. What do you burn down? If you start burning down your hedgerows first, then the Germans have an easier time firing at you. And if you move closer to their position, you will end up in the same situation as the other troops did before. You get caught in the interlocking fires of the German positions. Especially considering that the range of flamethrowers is lower than nearly all other weapons except maybe the hand grenades. So basically you are sitting duck for longer, not to mention that flamethrower equipped troops and tanks have the tendency to explode or at least burn quite extensively when hit improperly. And one issue was that the US forces were having major issues with tactics to give just one example. The experience of a platoon leader in the 9th Division illustrates how untried troops can react under fire. One of the fatal mistakes made by the infantry replacements is to hit the ground and freeze when fired upon. Once I ordered a squad to advance from one hedgerow to another. During the movement, one man was shot by a sniper firing one round. The entire squad hit the ground and they were picked off one by one by the same sniper. We also know that coordinating tanks and infantry was already quite an issue. Now if you add flamethrowers, I don't think it gets particularly more easier, because providing close cover for those guys that will be engaged primarily by the enemy is not a good idea. Especially considering that the Germans also have pre-mapped the terrain for artillery and mortar fire. Indirect fire was a key component of German defense. once pinned down in the open, pre-planned artillery and mortar fire punished American units. German mortar fire was particularly effective, causing as much as 75% of all US casualties during the Normandy campaign. And considering the fact that the impact of flamethrowers on troop morale is rather well known, I would assume that the Germans would target primarily anything equipped with a flamethrower, no matter if it was infantry carrying it or a tank with a mounted flamethrower. And well, there's also a final issue. Assuming you could set a fire to large areas, the problem is once something burns, it is hard to control. And considering that there's a lot of ammo and fuel all over the place, you don't really want that fire to come too close to your troops. But if the wind turns, that's often kinda hard to avoid. The chances that your hatches start to burn while the Germans' hatches don't is not completely unlikely. Additionally, there's smoke, which doesn't improve the sight nor the health and morale of your troops. Not to mention that the hatches likely would not burn down fully. Remember, these hatches were very old and the roots would not burn down and still provide quite some trouble. After all, if these hatches would have been regular hatches, the tanks would have far less problems in the first place. Now I assume it could be easier to cross the terrain for the attackers if everything was burnt down. But I could be terribly wrong here. For instance, about urban combat, I read several times that the rubble and ruins of bombed out cities give an advantage to the defenders, not the attackers. So creating a burnt down hellscape in Normandy might not be in your interest if you're attacking. To summarize, in short, I don't think it was feasible due to the lack of fuel, flamethrowers and wet weather. Additionally, I assume that even if it had been possible, the German tactics would have disposed of flamethrower troops as well as they did against regular troops. And finally, even if burning down would have been possible, the chances that it might have been beneficial to the US forces is also questionable. But hey, maybe I missed something, please let me know in the comment section. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you here to Andrew for reviewing the script and adding a point about the very old hatches. As always, source link in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode, thank you for watching and see you next time.